Here is Van Dieman's Golden Nugget Pumpkin. As an orange, it looks a lot like an orange cream icicle most of the time, though the swatch shows it has it looking more like it would be red. There is a bunch of tone shift as papers change, and it does shade from an orange to a red, like the red we see in the swatch. I think the shading is a result of the yellow we get to see in the chromatography. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs just fine with minimal feathering and only slight aggression getting deeper into the page. I wouldn't recommend this though for a student note taker. I do think that I would use this with no real reservations, so I would enjoy a bottle of it.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Creamsicle orange all day. That's what I see here. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade with a very large range. If you look at that D, it has just a little bit of a red lean in what's going on. It gets very light into the Dieman. The ST is quite a bit darker. The TR lighten up a whole lot with a darker TE at the end, just demonstrating the shading this ink offers. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Morning Frost, a shimmering ink.
Here is Van Dieman's Nutmeg.
Here is Van Dieman's Wasabi. Here is Van Dieman's Beetroot Relish.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, noticeably lighter most all of the time. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade nowhere near as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. In fact, you might have to work a little bit at times in order to find some of the shading. Look at work on the second line. The WOR are noticeably light, where the K just gets a little bit, you can see it, but a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, no ghosting, none of all of this deep penetration bled through to the page underneath, but it might stop you from using the back of the page.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here it is a whole lot lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. I think this is being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning we have a bit more translucent ink. It's a lot lighter than it was on the Portage, so it's not a problem, it's just a thing. The problem is the feathering that we see here. The feathering is quite frequent, and it is a little distracting to me. I don't see spreading of the lines, but I see the feathering very regularly. It has a tiny bit of shading, about as much shading as we saw on the Portage, not much, very faint, and nowhere gets dark. Looking at the back of the page, we get no ghosting. None of these spots we see deeper into the paper are going to bleed through to the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here it is, just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade nowhere near as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. I don't know how well I think this stands out here, meaning I see both the writing and the quad rule, but sometimes not as much of the quad rule. This, for me, because of that, I wouldn't use it, but it doesn't mean that other people wouldn't be very happy with it on quad rule paper. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, no ghosting, but we do have a couple of spots that it got deeper into the paper. Now, it only really occurred over here, which makes me think it was more of a paper malfunction, like an aging of the page type thing, than the ink on the paper. But it did occur on this coated paper, so it's something to be aware of.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more orange inks.
Here is Diatramentis Michelangelo Ochre Yellow. Here is Krishna Goldfish. Here is Private Reserve Shoreline Gold. Here is Sailor Gentle Apricot.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter and flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely shades at all, though we can always go out of our way and find some preferable amount of shadings, like preferable on the first line. That P is fairly dark. Very light I next to it, dark E, midtone F, light E, midtone R, light AB with a very dark LE at the end. It does not stand out well enough to me on this paper to be a primary note-taking color. However, as a second note-taking color to add additional information, I think this would be very good. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pannonia Conservatory Keck Blue.
Here is Dieman Espresso. Here is Vinta Summer Green Carnival. Here is Monteverde Rose Noir.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is a whole lot lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. There are tiny little feathers that do occur at moments. They are not in themselves a problem. They are barely noticeable. The spread that occurs is a normal amount of spread for copy paper. It does shade just a little bit. I think the very gentle orange tone could be a really good ink on this paper as a tremendous alternative to red. Looking at the back of the page, we get no real ghosting. We get nothing that bleeds through the page underneath. A little less deep penetration than we have seen. This I wouldn't write on the back of the page, but I do think would be a good ink for this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow broad of the Kaweco Sport gives a mid-tone orange with some nice shading. Off camera, I tried it in a wet broad. It darkened nicely and looked even better and shaded just as well. Now I go for a wet medium for the darker version of this mid-tone orange that shades to a very red-leaning orange quite nicely.